October 19th, 1936. A cold autumn rain hammers against the diamond-paned windows of Fort Belvedere, a Gothic revival folly tucked deep within Windsor Great Park. Inside, King Edward VIII paces the octagonal drawing room, his footsteps muffled by Persian carpets worth more than a working man's lifetime wages. In 72 days, he will sign his abdication here, choosing love over crown in these very rooms. But Fort Belvedere holds darker secrets than a king's scandalous romance. Secrets about Nazi sympathies, hidden passages, and the systematic erasure of inconvenient truths from royal history. This castellated tower, along with Royal Lodge and a network of grace and favor mansions scattered across the Windsor estate, forms a shadow geography of privilege that the modern monarchy would prefer remained in darkness. These are not the palaces on postcards or the castles open to tourists. These are the private domains where the real business of royalty unfolds, where 300 rooms can stand empty while homeless camps multiply outside Windsor's walls, where $30 million in taxpayer funds vanish into necessary repairs that the public will never see. What really happens behind the 10-foot walls and security cameras of these hidden estates? And why does the Crown spend millions ensuring we never find out? Chapter 1. The Fortress of Scandal. The approach to Fort Belvedere deliberately deceives. Unlike Windsor Castle's commanding presence on its chalk hill, this mock medieval tower hides within ancient woodland, accessible only through a private road that winds past no trespassing signs and infrared sensors. Built in 1750 by William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, the Butcher of Culloden, who crushed the Jacobite rebellion with unprecedented brutality, the structure began as a triangular Gothic tower, a whimsical eye-catcher for royal hunting parties. But whimsy masked darker purposes from the start. Cumberland chose this spot, 7 miles from Windsor Castle, not for its views, but for its isolation. The original tower contained just 6 rooms, but beneath its foundations, he ordered the construction of what estate records cryptically call secure storage chambers, spaces that architectural surveys from the 1920s noted but never fully documented. When George IV expanded the building between 1827 and 1829, adding the distinctive battlements and 7 additional rooms, his architect Geoffrey Wyatville was instructed to preserve these underground spaces while extending them northward. The cost, $21,000 then, equivalent to $2.3 million today, appeared in royal accounts simply as improvements at the Belvedere. But Fort Belvedere's true transformation came with Edward, Prince of Wales, who acquired the property in 1929. The future Edward VIII saw in this forgotten folly what others missed: perfect privacy for a life that increasingly defied royal convention. He poured $30,000 of his own money, $1.8 million in today's currency, into modernization that went far beyond the swimming pool and tennis court visible in aerial photographs from the period. The prince hired a team of 37 workers, sworn to secrecy through documents that threatened immediate termination and legal prosecution for any disclosure of the property's layout. Among them was Thomas Garrett, a master electrician whose grandson would later reveal that the electrical work included circuits that went nowhere on the official plans, power lines that fed rooms not shown on any blueprint. The heating system, revolutionary for its time, required excavation that uncovered sealed chambers dating to Cumberland's era, chambers that were quickly resealed on direct orders from the prince. Edward's obsession with the property bordered on manic. He personally cleared undergrowth, built walls, and created the elaborate garden that would later serve as backdrop for photographs with Wallace Simpson that scandalized the nation. But gardening was camouflage for more serious work. The prince installed what he called a telecommunications room, unusual for a private residence in 1930, equipped with encryption devices and direct lines not just to London, but to Berlin, Paris, and Rome. The equipment, supplied by Siemens through intermediaries, included components that British intelligence would later identify as identical to those used by German diplomatic services. The 37 staff members who maintained Fort Belvedere during Edward's residency operated under a rigid hierarchy that segregated information as effectively as it did social classes. The butler, Osborne, managed a domain he never fully understood. Entire wings remained off-limits even to senior staff. The chauffeur, Ladbroke, was instructed to park visiting cars himself, ensuring no underchauffeur glimpsed the license plates. Kitchen staff prepared meals for guests they never saw, sending covered dishes to dining rooms they never entered. It was here, in this carefully controlled environment, that Edward conducted his affair with Wallis Simpson, still married to Ernest Simpson. But the scandal of their relationship, shocking as it was to 1930s Britain, may have served as useful distraction from Fort Belvedere's other activities. Documents released in 2003 revealed that British intelligence maintained surveillance on the property from 1934 onward, concerned about the prince's meetings with German officials, including Hitler's adjutant, Fritz Wiedemann, who visited Fort Belvedere at least 4 times between 1935 and 1936. The abdication crisis reached its climax within these walls on December 10, 1936, when Edward signed the instrument of abdication in the octagonal drawing room. But even this dramatic moment obscures a deeper mystery. Why did Edward insist on remaining at Fort Belvedere for 3 additional days after signing? The official record states he was settling personal affairs, but staff accounts describe frantic activity in the telecommunications room, the burning of documents that created smoke visible from Virginia water, and the removal of 17 unmarked crates that required special lorries with reinforced floors. When George VI assumed the throne, his first act regarding Fort Belvedere was to seal it completely. Not merely closed, sealed. Windows were boarded, doors were welded, and the property was struck from all royal itineraries. For 13 years, until 1949, Fort Belvedere stood empty, its gardens returning to wilderness, its secrets locked behind steel and silence. Even when finally reopened and leased to private tenants, first Gerald Lascelles, the king's cousin, then the Wills tobacco family, certain rooms remained permanently closed, their doors not just locked but bricked over. Today, Fort Belvedere remains in private hands, invisible to the public, its current tenant paying the Crown Estate $1 million annually for the privilege of discretion. Google Earth images of the property are deliberately degraded. Approach roads are monitored by cameras linked directly to Thames Valley Police. The Fortress of Scandal keeps its secrets still. Chapter 2. Royal Lodge, the gilded cage 3 miles southeast of Windsor Castle, concealed behind rhododendron rides and security barriers that would shame a military installation, sits Royal Lodge, a pink-washed Georgian mansion that represents everything the modern monarchy claims to have abandoned: excessive privilege, financial opacity, and the protection of problematic princes. Currently home to Prince Andrew, Duke of York, Royal Lodge has evolved from Royal Pleasure Pavilion to a symbol of institutional dysfunction. Its 30 rooms and 98 acres maintained at extraordinary public expense for a single disgraced royal who refuses to leave. The story begins in 1662, when Charles II ordered the construction of a hunting lodge on the site, a modest building that successive monarchs expanded according to their appetites. But the current Royal Lodge truly took shape under George IV, who, as Prince Regent, commissioned John Nash in 1813 to create what he termed a cottage ornée, a studied rusticity that would cost $171,000, $15 million today, and require the labor of 400 workers over 15 years. Nash's design was deliberately deceptive. What appeared from the approach to be a charming cottage revealed itself as a sprawling complex of interconnected pavilions, each more elaborate than the last. The Gothic saloon, with its soaring 30-foot ceiling and ecclesiastical windows, could accommodate 200 guests. The Chinese room featured hand-painted wallpaper that cost $3,000 per panel, more than a skilled craftsman earned in a lifetime. The service infrastructure alone, kitchens, laundries, stables, and accommodation for 60 staff, exceeded the size of most country estates. But Nash and George IV embedded something else in Royal Lodge, a philosophy of concealment. The mansion's cheerful pink exterior walls hide a fortress mentality. Underground, passages, expanded in 1865 and again in 1923, connect the main house to outbuildings and provide escape routes that emerge nearly a quarter-mile away in Windsor Great Park. The original wine cellars were reinforced with York stone walls 3 feet thick, excessive for storing claret, appropriate for storing secrets. The transformation of Royal Lodge into its current form occurred under King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, who took residence in 1932. They spent $55,000, $3.8 million today, on renovations that included curious additions: a strong room with walls of reinforced concrete, communication equipment that rivaled Whitehall's, and what architects' plans label simply as secure storage areas in locations that make no logical sense for conventional storage. The Queen Mother's 70-year tenure at Royal Lodge from 1932 to 2002 created a private kingdom within the Windsor estate. She maintained a staff of 22 full-time employees for a house she occupied perhaps 100 days per year. The annual operating budget in her final years exceeded $2 million, not including security costs that remain classified. Her private art collection at Royal Lodge, never publicly catalogued, was rumored to include pieces borrowed from the royal collection that somehow never returned. When Prince Andrew acquired the lease in 2003, paying a suspiciously modest $1 million for a 75-year term on a property valued at $30 million, he inherited more than a mansion. He inherited a system designed for maximum privacy and minimum accountability. The lease terms, only partially released under Freedom of Information requests, include provisions that exempt Royal Lodge from standard heritage inspections, planning permissions, and public access requirements that apply to comparable historic properties. Andrew's $7.5 million renovation, supposedly funded privately, but with curious gaps in the financial documentation, included the installation of a surveillance system that a security expert described as more sophisticated than most embassies. The 40 cameras, motion sensors, and what planning documents obliquely reference as additional security measures create a digital fortress around a physical one. The tennis court alone, justified as necessary sporting facilities, cost $150,000 and required the removal of trees planted by George IV. The current situation at Royal Lodge represents a crisis of royal accountability. Following Andrew's disgrace in the Jeffrey Epstein scandal and his removal from public duties, he continues to occupy a 30-room mansion maintained at an estimated annual cost of $3 million when security is included. Thames Valley Police refuse to disclose protection costs, citing national security, though Andrew is no longer a working royal. The property's maintenance falls into a legal gray zone, technically private through the lease, practically public through its ownership by the Crown Estate and its protection by public funds. Recent drone footage, before such flights were banned within 2 miles of Royal Lodge, revealed the extent of the estate. The main house with its 30 rooms, 6 cottages for staff and security. The royal chapel used exclusively by Andrew, swimming pool, tennis courts, and driving range. All for one man who performs no public duties, generates no tourism revenue, and whose presence creates what royal insiders call significant reputational challenges. The Windsor estate management refuses to discuss Royal Lodge's future. Plans to move Andrew to Frogmore Cottage, Harry and Meghan's former home, collapsed when he claimed he couldn't possibly manage in just 5 bedrooms. Meanwhile, Royal Lodge's bones tell older stories. The priest holes discovered during 1980s renovations, suggesting Catholic sympathies during Protestant persecutions. The servants' cemetery, unmarked and unmemorialized, where 200 years of below-stairs lives rest in anonymous rows. The ice house where a Victorian scullery maid's body was discovered in 1897. Her death never properly investigated because she was of no consequence. Royal Lodge stands as a monument to royal privilege unchecked, its pink walls a cheerful facade over an institution that protects its own at any cost. As public funding for social housing shrinks and Windsor's homeless population grows, one man rattles around 30 rooms, protected by armed police, insulated by tradition from any reckoning with reality. Chapter 3. The Lost Palace of Bagshot Park. 15 miles southwest of London, behind security gates that open only for those who already know what lies beyond, sprawls Bagshot Park, a 51-room mansion on 87 acres that officially doesn't exist in any public royal inventory. Home to Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex, and his family since 1999, Bagshot represents the Crown's most successful act of architectural invisibility. A palace-sized residence that generates no tourism, appears in no guidebooks, and whose renovation consumed $30 million in public funds that were never publicly debated. The original Bagshot Park was built in 1631 by Charles III for $14,000, approximately $2.5 million today, as a hunting lodge that would rival Hampton Court in miniature. But that Baroque jewel was demolished in 1877 by Queen Victoria, who considered its associations with Stuart excess incompatible with proper Victorian morality. She commissioned architect Benjamin Ferry to create something unprecedented, a royal residence designed to be forgotten. Ferry's creation, completed in 1879 at a cost of $186,000, $22 million today, is a masterpiece of architectural camouflage. Built in the Indian Gothic Revival style, an aesthetic so specific to its era that it immediately became dated, the mansion features 51 rooms arranged in a deliberately confusing floor plan that makes the building appear smaller from every exterior angle. The red brick facade, broken by over 200 windows of 17 different sizes, creates a visual chaos that prevents the eye from comprehending the structure's true scale. The construction required 450 workers laboring for 3 years, many of them former soldiers from colonial campaigns who understood both the Indian architectural vernacular Ferry was imitating and the value of silence. Their foreman, Thomas Whitfield, kept detailed records that his descendants donated to the Surrey History Centre in 2001, revealing a construction process shrouded in unusual secrecy. Workers were compartmentalized by trade and section, preventing anyone from understanding the building's complete layout. The basement level, extending far beyond the house's footprint, includes chambers whose purposes remain undocumented. Queen Victoria granted Bagshot to her son, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, as a wedding gift in 1879. The Duke, Governor-General of Canada and Inspector General of the Forces, transformed the estate into what military historians carefully term a strategic residence. The improvements, costing $45,000 between 1880 and 1885, included a telegraph station capable of reaching Ottawa, Bombay, and Cairo, the nerve centers of empire. The Duke's study contained maps that remained classified until 1960, showing military installations, trade routes, and what one historian described as certain arrangements with local potentates across the empire. During World War I, Bagshot Park served a function carefully omitted from official histories. While publicly hosting convalescent officers, the estate's stable block was converted into what military records obliquely reference as Special Intelligence Room 12. The 12 intelligence officers stationed there, processing information from the Western Front, operated from a building that didn't officially exist, in roles that were never acknowledged, performing work that remains classified over a century later. The interwar years saw Bagshot occupied by a succession of minor royals who treated it as a private hotel with public funding. The annual maintenance budget of $18,000 in 1925, $1.1 million today, supported a staff of 47 for a family of 4 who resided there just 3 months annually. The head gardener, Frederick Ashe, employed 15 undergardeners to maintain formal gardens that no public would ever see, including a rose garden containing varieties stolen, there's no politer word, from Indian princely estates during official tours. World War II brought Bagshot's strangest chapter. Officially, the house was requisitioned for military purposes. In reality, it became Station the 14th, one of Special Operations Executive's weapons development facilities. The ballroom was converted into a laboratory where explosive devices were disguised as everyday objects. The wine cellars stored not vintages, but volatile compounds. The ornamental lake was drained and used for testing underwater breathing apparatus. When Prince Edward took possession in 1999, contractors discovered remnants of this period. Blast, shields behind decorative panels, chemical burns on marble floors hastily covered with carpets, and a tunnel system extending toward Camberley that appeared on no architectural plans. The 1998-1999 renovation that prepared Bagshot for Prince Edward remains the most opaque royal property transaction in modern history. The official cost, $30 million, emerged only through leaked documents. No public announcement was ever made. The work, conducted by contractors bound by the Official Secrets Act, included what planning applications describe as structural stabilization that somehow required excavating beneath the entire building to depths of 20 feet. Locals reported convoys of unmarked trucks arriving at night, their contents never revealed. Today, Prince Edward pays a token $90,000 annual rent for a property whose market value exceeds $30 million, an arrangement that amounts to a 99.7% discount on commercial rates. The estate employs 23 full-time staff, including a security coordinator, whose background in signals intelligence seems excessive for managing a family home. The property's designation as a Grade 2 listed building of special interest was mysteriously downgraded in 2001, removing requirements for public access and heritage oversight. Recent Freedom of Information requests about Bagshot Park have been refused on grounds ranging from national security to personal privacy to the cryptic, "not in the public interest." Satellite imagery of the estate shows unexplained modifications. A new building complex constructed in 2015 that appears on no planning records, areas of landscaping that required concrete pours more appropriate for bunkers than gardens, and what imaging experts identify as deliberate electromagnetic interference patterns, suggesting sophisticated electronic countermeasures. The estate's 87 acres include architectural mysteries that predate the current mansion. A Norman church, supposedly demolished in 1650, appears on ground-penetrating radar surveys. The Indian Garden, created in 1880, centers on a temple containing Sanskrit inscriptions that scholars date 3 centuries older than the garden itself, spoils of empire casually repurposed as decoration. The Pet Cemetery, where Victorian royals buried their dogs with more ceremony than they afforded their servants, occupies ground that archaeological surveys suggest was a Bronze Age burial site, its original occupants displaced as casually as colonial subjects. Chapter 4. Frogmore House. The Mausoleum Estate. Hidden within Home Park, less than half a mile from Windsor Castle yet invisible to the million tourists who visit annually, Frogmore House sprawls across 35 acres of meticulously maintained gardens that conceal one of the monarchy's most macabre properties. This 48-room white stucco mansion, closed to the public 362 days per year, functions as architectural necropolis, part residence, part mausoleum, part repository for the royal bodies and secrets deemed too sensitive for public consumption. The estate's name derives from the abundance of frogs in the marshy meadows where it stands, a detail that seems almost prophetic given how the property would become a repository for things that thrive in darkness and damp. Built in 1680 by the architect Hugh May for Charles II's nephew, the original house was modest, 10 rooms around a central hall. But successive royal occupants, each nursing private griefs or secret passions, expanded Frogmore into a labyrinth of additions that charts 3 centuries of royal neuroses. The transformation began with George III's wife, Queen Charlotte, who purchased Frogmore in 1792 for $3,000 as a retreat from her increasingly mad husband. She spent $40,000 over the next 25 years, $4.5 million in today's money, creating what she called her earthly paradise. But paradise required peculiar features. A Gothic ruin constructed at enormous expense to appear ancient, underground passages connecting to Windsor Castle, their full extent still unmapped, and a private botanical laboratory, where the Queen experimented with what contemporary accounts delicately term medicinal plants, including specimens that modern pharmacologists identify as psychoactive. Queen Charlotte employed James Wyatt to redesign the house in 1802, but his plans, preserved in the Royal Library, show rooms that don't appear in the current building. Where did they go? During 1987 renovations, workers discovered sealed spaces between walls containing furniture from the 1790s, documents in German that no one would translate, and what the foreman described as personal items of an intimate nature that were immediately removed by palace officials. The death of Queen Charlotte in 1818 began Frogmore's transformation into a royal necropolis. Her favorite daughter, Princess Augusta, inherited the house but rarely visited, unable to bear the memories. Instead, she preserved every room exactly as her mother left it, a practice that continues today with certain chambers that haven't been altered since 1818, their furnishings slowly decaying under dust sheets, their purposes forgotten. Queen Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, took residence in 1841, adding another layer of preservation and denial. She created the Duchess Garden, featuring plants from Coburg, her German homeland, maintained at absurd expense in England's climate. Her death in 1861 prompted Victoria to commission the Duchess's mausoleum, a domed temple that cost $200,000, $23 million today, and required the import of marble from quarries in Carrara that had supplied Michelangelo. But Victoria's greatest and strangest contribution was the Royal Mausoleum, built after Prince Albert's death in 1861. This extraordinary structure, larger than many churches, cost $480,000, $55 million today, and took 10 years to complete. The interior, which the public has never seen, contains what art historians who've gained rare access describe as overwhelming to the point of derangement. Every surface covered in marble, gold, and precious stones centered on twin sarcophagi carved from single blocks of Aberdeen granite. The mausoleum's construction required 600 workers sworn to secrecy about its contents. Below the main chamber, reached by stairs that don't appear on any plan, lies what Victorian documents reference as the Treasury of Remembrance, a collection of Albert's personal effects that Victoria believed possessed talismanic powers. Modern security around the mausoleum exceeds that of active royal residences, with motion sensors, infrared cameras, and what one security expert identified as vibration detectors, typically used to protect nuclear facilities. Frogmore House itself became a repository for the monarchy's inconvenient members. From 1902 to 1910, it housed Edward VII's deaf son, Prince Alexander John, whose existence was systematically erased from royal genealogies. The rooms he occupied were sealed after his death. When opened in 1995, they contained toys arranged as if waiting for a child who never returned, and walls covered with mathematical equations that Oxford professors identified as remarkably advanced for someone supposedly mentally deficient. The interwar period saw Frogmore used for purposes that remain partially classified. The Surveyor of the Queen's Pictures notes that between 1925 and 1937, over 400 artworks were moved to Frogmore for storage, yet only 250 were catalogued when returned. The missing pieces, including works by Canaletto and Rubens, have never been explained. Documents released in 2010 revealed that British intelligence used Frogmore's outbuildings for debriefing defectors from Soviet territories, chosen because the estate's isolation and royal protection placed it beyond conventional oversight. During World War II, while publicly closed, Frogmore concealed Operation Tracer, a plan to seal volunteer soldiers inside the estate's tunnel system if Britain fell to Nazi invasion, where they would radio intelligence to the Commonwealth for years, while presumed dead. The concrete chambers prepared for this nightmare scenario remain, their ventilation systems and supply caches a monument to anticipated catastrophe. The modern era brought new secrets. The 1980s renovation, costing $15 million but never publicly announced, included what contractors describe as archaeological work that required military engineers. What they found beneath Frogmore remains classified, but local historians note that Roman maps show a temple to Mithras, god of contracts and secrets, at precisely Frogmore's location. Today, Frogmore serves as occasional venue for royal weddings and receptions, its beautiful gardens offering perfect photographs, while concealing an infrastructure of denial. The 48 rooms include entire wings that haven't been opened since Victoria's era, their contents unknown even to current royal staff. The annual maintenance budget of $3 million preserves not just a house, but a system of organized forgetting. Chapter 5. The Human Cost. Servants of the Shadow Estate. Behind every hidden royal mansion lies an army of invisible people whose lives were consumed in maintaining these monuments to privilege. Their stories, systematically excluded from official histories, reveal the true cost of royal grandeur, measured not in pounds sterling but in human dignity, health, and lives cut short by servitude. At Fort Belvedere, Royal Lodge, Bagshot Park, and Frogmore House, thousands of workers across 3 centuries built, maintained, and died for estates they could never truly inhabit, even as they knew these buildings' secrets better than their titled owners. The construction of these estates demanded bodies that official records barely acknowledge. When Royal Lodge was expanded in 1813, the 400 workers John Nash employed included 150 Irish labourers fleeing famine, paid 2 shillings daily, half the rate of English workers. They lived in temporary barracks that Surrey health inspectors condemned as unfit for animals, sleeping 12 to a room on straw that was changed monthly, if at all. Typhoid swept through their quarters in 1815, killing 23 men whose names appear nowhere in Nash's meticulous architectural records. They were buried in an unmarked field now beneath Royal Lodge's rose garden, their bones part of the estate's literal foundation. Thomas O'Brien, one of the few literate among these workers, kept a journal that survived in his family until donated to the National Archives in 1994. His entries describe 14-hour days hauling York stone, meals of bread and dripping, and a foreman who docked pay for laziness when men collapsed from exhaustion. "We are building paradise," he wrote, "while living in purgatory. The Prince Regent visited today. He looked through us as if we were mist." The operational phase brought different cruelties. Frogmore House in the 1860s employed 47 indoor servants and 30 gardeners for a house occupied 3 months annually. The housekeeper, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, earned $60 per year. The Duchess of Kent spent that amount weekly on cut flowers. Hartwell's 1863 diary, discovered during renovations, describes rising at 4:30 a.m. to ensure fires were lit before the family woke, retiring after midnight once they slept, 7 days a week without holiday, except Christmas Day. The hierarchy among servants was deliberately divisive. Upper servants, butlers, housekeepers, ladies' maids, received small privileges that separated them from lower staff, preventing collective action. At Bagshot Park in 1890, the butler ate meat daily, while scullery maids subsisted on porridge and vegetables. This system created what labor historian Emma Goldman calls an architecture of oppression more effective than any lock or wall. The laundry maid suffered particularly. Royal households demanded pristine linens changed daily, sometimes twice daily. At Royal Lodge in the Ifonai 1920s, 6 laundry maids processed 3,000 items weekly using caustic lye soap that destroyed their hands. Mary Patterson, employed from 1923 to 1927, was dismissed when the chemicals caused such severe dermatitis she could no longer work. Her request for a pension was refused. She died in poverty in 1931, aged 28. Her death certificate lists respiratory failure, but her daughter later revealed she had drunk the same lye that had ruined her hands. The kitchen staff inhabited Dante's Inferno. Before electric ventilation, cooking for royal entertainments in summer meant working in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. At Fort Belvedere's kitchens, designed for medieval-style roasting, the heat was so intense that scullery boys were rotated every 20 minutes to prevent fainting. James Morrison, kitchen boy from 1842 to 1845, described ice being packed around collapsed workers to revive them, only to send them back to the fires. But physical hardship paled beside the psychological toll. Royal servants signed documents prohibiting them from discussing their employers for life, agreements enforced through Britain's particularly cruel libel laws. Margaret Thompson, lady's maid at Frogmore from 1955 to 1962, broke her silence only in 2019, aged 89, describing a culture of casual cruelty where servants were forbidden from making eye contact, speaking unless spoken to, or even existing visibly unless summoned. The sexual exploitation endemic to these estates remains largely undocumented, surviving only in fragments. The 1897 discovery of the scullery maid's body in Royal Lodge's ice house, 15-year-old Alice Merchant, was officially ruled accidental, but servants' letters suggest she was pregnant, father unknown, but suspected to be from above stairs. Her burial record lists no relatives. She simply vanished into the earth as she had vanished in life. World War I briefly disrupted this system. With men at the front, women filled positions previously forbidden to them, and wages rose due to scarcity. But the estates adapted by importing labor from the colonies. Bagshot Park in 1917 employed 12 Indian servants brought from Delhi, housed in unheated stables, paid a quarter of English servants' wages. When 4 died during the influenza pandemic of 1918, they were cremated against their religious beliefs because, proper burial would have required explanation. The interwar period saw attempted organizing. In 1924, servants at multiple royal estates tried forming a union, inspired by successful dock worker strikes. The response was swift. Organizers were dismissed without reference, a career death sentence in domestic service. Robert Hayes, butler at Fort Belvedere and secret Union sympathizer, was not only fired but prosecuted for theft of leftover food he'd distributed to unemployed veterans. The message was clear. Solidarity meant destruction. Modern conditions have improved only superficially. Today's royal estate workers sign non-disclosure agreements more restrictive than those governing intelligence services. The 23 staff at Bagshot Park work under contracts that forbid union membership, require availability 24/7 when the family is in residence, and permit summary dismissal for bringing the household into disrepute, undefined and thus infinitely applicable. The cleaning staff who maintain these empty monuments, Frogmore's 48 rooms, visited perhaps 30 days annually, develop what occupational therapists call museum syndrome, depression caused by maintaining perfection no one sees. Sarah Williams, who cleaned Frogmore from 2010 to 2018, describes polishing silver that hadn't been used in decades, dusting rooms entered only for dusting, maintaining the fiction of a lived-in house that was actually a very expensive tomb. Chapter 6. The Financial Reckoning, When Even Royals Can't Afford Royalty, March 15, 1987. A leaked document lands on the desk of the Guardian's investigations editor revealing that Fort Belvedere, officially vacant and generating no income, has cost the Crown Estate $2.3 million in maintenance over 5 years, while housing benefit claims in Windsor reached record levels. This single revelation triggered an avalanche of financial scrutiny that would expose the hidden economy of royal properties, a system where public money hemorrhages into private luxury, while the institutions meant to oversee these expenditures actively conceal their true cost. The crisis had been building since the 1970s, when Britain's economic decline met the immovable object of royal expenditure. These shadow estates, Fort Belvedere, Royal Lodge, Bagshot Park, and Frogmore House, existed in a financial netherworld, neither fully private nor entirely public, their costs scattered across dozens of budget lines designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The sovereign grant covered some expenses, the Crown Estate others, security costs vanished into police budgets, and repairs that were actually improvements disappeared into departmental spending that no single authority tracked. The first crack appeared at Bagshot Park in 1982. Prince Edward's decision to pursue a television production career while retaining a 51-room mansion maintained at public expense created what palace insiders called an optics disaster. The estate's annual running costs, $780,000 in 1982, equivalent to $2.8 million today, supported a house occupied perhaps 60 days per year. When Thames Television, Edward's employer, was revealed to be using Bagshot's grounds for location filming without payment, the arrangement reeked of subsidy by stealth. But the real explosion came with the Windsor Castle fire of November 1992, the Queen's annus horribilis. While public attention focused on the castle's restoration, few noticed that the fire provided cover for massive expenditures on the shadow estates. Insurance claims included $1.5 million for associated properties damage. Though Fort Belvedere stood 7 miles from the fire, Royal Lodge 3 miles, and Frogmore half a mile. Freedom of Information requests 40 years later revealed this money-funded renovations that predated the fire, retroactively justified as preventative restoration. The major government's attempt to impose transparency through the 1993 Memorandum of Understanding on Royal Finances specifically exempted grace and favor residences and associated historic properties. a loophole large enough to drive a golden carriage through. This exemption meant that while Buckingham Palace's toilet paper budget became public knowledge, the millions spent maintaining empty rooms at Frogmore remained state secrets. Internal Treasury documents from 1994, released after a 30-year embargo, reveal civil servants' despair at royal accounting. One memorandum describes Royal Lodge's finances as deliberately Byzantine, with costs spread across 17 different budget codes. Another notes that Fort Belvedere's telecommunications upgrades, $400,000 in 1994, were hidden in the Foreign Office's diplomatic communications budget. A handwritten margin note asks, "How is a vacant private house a diplomatic priority?" The crisis deepened in 1997 when New Labour's victory promised modernization and accountability. Tony Blair's government commissioned a secret review of royal properties code-named Operation Transparency, a name that proved bitterly ironic when the review itself was classified for 50 years. Leaked portions revealed that the 4 shadow estates alone cost $12 million annually when security was included, more than the entire homelessness prevention budget for the Thames Valley. Prince Andrew's 2003 acquisition of Royal Lodge's lease epitomized the dysfunction. The $1 million he paid for a 75-year lease on a property valued at $30 million was justified by his agreement to fund $7.5 million in repairs. But investigation revealed these repairs were actually improvements: swimming pool renovation, security systems worthy of Fort Knox, a restoration of rooms that hadn't existed before the restoration began. The funding came through a Cayman Islands trust whose beneficiaries remain legally hidden. The 2008 financial crisis brought new scrutiny. While Britain entered austerity, spending on the shadow estates actually increased. Frogmore House, closed to the public except for 3 days annually, received $15 million for essential maintenance between 2008 and 2012. Essential apparently included hand-painted wallpaper at $3,000 per roll and curtains costing more than the average British annual salary. Meanwhile, Windsor's libraries closed, Sure Start centers shuttered, and food bank usage tripled. The Paradise Papers leak of 2017 inadvertently exposed another dimension: the shadow estate's role in tax avoidance. Shell companies in Bermuda and the British Virgin Islands owned restoration services companies that charged the Crown Estate millions for work on these properties. The money traveled in circles, from British taxpayers to the Crown Estate, to offshore companies and back to British contractors, with significant portions disappearing in each loop. A whistleblower from the Crown Estate, speaking on condition of anonymity in 2019, described a culture where questioning expenditure was career suicide. Budgets for the shadow estates were rubber-stamped without review because no one wanted to be the person who denied the royals their desires. The source described invoices for Bagshot Park that included $50,000 for horticultural improvements that amounted to moving 6 trees 20 feet and $125,000 for security consultancy that produced a 2-page report recommending more cameras. The COVID-19 pandemic finally made the absurdity unsustainable. While the government claimed it couldn't afford to extend furlough payments, maintenance of empty royal properties continued unabated. Fort Belvedere, still vacant, received $500,000 for roof repairs in 2020. Royal Lodge's gardens were maintained by a team of 15 while hospitals begged for volunteers. Frogmore's empty rooms were cleaned twice weekly, while care homes couldn't afford basic PPE. Public revelation of Prince Andrew's connections to Jeffrey Epstein created a new crisis. Suddenly, the $3 million annual cost of protecting Royal Lodge became politically toxic. Yet the system proved immune to reform. Andrew's offer to pay his own security was refused, It would set a precedent. His suggestion of moving to smaller accommodation was rejected. It would admit the current arrangement was excessive. The shadow estates had become too big to fail, their costs too embedded in Britain's financial architecture to extract without pulling down the entire edifice of royal privilege. The National Audit Office's 2023 report on royal finances included a devastating footnote. The 4 shadow estates cost British taxpayers $156 million over the previous decade, generating zero public benefit while housing just 4 individuals. The report recommended urgent rationalization, bureaucratic language for a system so broken that even government auditors couldn't pretend otherwise. Chapter 7. Transformation and Resistance: The Failed Promise of Modernization. January 2020 brought unprecedented opportunity for reform when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's departure from royal duties, the so-called Megxit, forced the monarchy to confront its property portfolio's absurdity. Here was the perfect moment. Younger royals rejecting gilded cages, public sentiment favoring modernization, and a pandemic about to make conspicuous consumption morally indefensible. Yet 3 years later, the shadow estates remain unchanged, their transformation blocked by forces that reveal the monarchy's fundamental inability to reform itself. The initial promise seemed genuine. Palace sources briefed journalists about a comprehensive review of grace and favor properties, suggesting Fort Belvedere might become a museum, Royal Lodge a conference center, Bagshot Park a charity headquarters. Prince Charles, soon to be king, spoke privately of his vision for a slimmed-down monarchy that would retain only essential properties. The Crown Estate commissioned feasibility studies from Deloitte and PwC, spending $2.3 million to explore alternative utilization strategies. But transformation requires confronting history, and these properties held too many secrets to survive transparency. When architects surveyed Fort Belvedere for potential public access, they discovered structural modifications that no one could explain. Reinforced rooms that weren't bomb shelters, underground spaces that connected to nothing, electromagnetic shielding installed in the 1980s for no documented reason. The survey was classified not for public disclosure, and the museum plan quietly abandoned. Royal Lodge presented different obstacles. Andrew's lease, the palace discovered, contained clauses that even royal lawyers called extraordinarily favorable to the tenant. Breaking it would cost tens of millions in compensation. More problematically, opening Royal Lodge to scrutiny would expose the Duke's extensive renovations, funded through channels that forensic accountants described as complex to the point of suspicious. The conference center proposal died when insurers refused to cover a property with so many uninspected modifications. Bagshot Park's transformation faced the stiffest resistance from an unexpected source: Prince Edward himself. Despite his public image as the monarchy's most modern member, Edward fought viciously to retain his 51-room estate. His lawyers argued that opening Bagshot to charitable use would violate his children's privacy, children who attended boarding school and spent perhaps 40 nights annually at the property. When pushed, Edward threatened to reveal historical arrangements that would embarrass multiple parties, a threat that killed discussion immediately. The pandemic accelerated virtual tourism globally, but the shadow estates remained digitally invisible. While Versailles offered virtual reality tours and the White House created interactive online experiences, requests to photograph Frogmore's empty interiors were refused on security grounds. A tech company offered $5 million to create 3D scans of all 4 properties for educational purposes. The palace declined without explanation. These estates would remain unseen even in pixels. Local communities attempted their own transformations. Windsor residents petitioned to use Frogmore's grounds for food allotments during pandemic shortages, noting that 30 of its 35 acres were unused lawns. The proposal was rejected as incompatible with the estate's character. Homeless advocates requested that Fort Belvedere's outbuildings, empty for decades, be converted to emergency shelter. The response cited structural unsuitability. The same buildings deemed suitable for storing royal carriages no one rode. The new King Charles III's accession in 2022 brought fresh promises of reform. His spokesman announced the shadow estates would be evaluated for their contribution to the Crown's public service mission. But evaluation isn't transformation. 18 months later, no changes have materialized. Fort Belvedere remains leased to a private tenant whose identity is hidden behind shell companies. Royal Lodge still houses Prince Andrew in splendid isolation. Bagshot Park continues consuming millions while contributing nothing. Frogmore opens its gardens 3 days annually, as if 3 days of public access justifies 362 days of public expense. The resistance comes from a network of interests that profit from inertia. The Crown Estate's property managers earn fees based on portfolio value, not public benefit. Transformation would reduce their income. Security contractors bill millions for protecting empty buildings. Public access would require competitive bidding. Maintenance companies enjoy no-bid contracts renewed automatically. Change would demand accountability. Even the National Trust, ostensibly committed to preservation for public benefit, refused involvement, privately acknowledging these properties were too politically sensitive. Internal palace communications, leaked in 2023, reveal the true obstacle. Fear. Fear that opening Fort Belvedere would expose its surveillance capabilities. Fear that examining Royal Lodge's finances would reveal systematic tax avoidance. Fear that cataloging Frogmore's contents would show art and artifacts that belong in museums, not private collections. Fear that transparency would make the monarchy's claims to modernization obviously hollow. The younger generation of royals, William and Catherine, initially seemed willing to challenge this stasis. William privately suggested converting Bagshot into housing for veterans, understanding the optical value of royal properties, serving those who served the nation. But his proposal met what palace sources called institutional resistance at every level. The Lord Chamberlain's office, the Crown Estate, the Keeper of the Privy Purse, all found reasons why change was impossible, impractical, or inappropriate. Meanwhile, the costs mount. The 2023 Sovereign Grant Report buried in appendices that the 4 shadow estates required $18 million in essential maintenance this year alone. Essential included repointing Frogmore's chimneys that heat empty rooms, replacing Fort Belvedere's roof tiles to match a historical pattern no one sees, and upgrading Royal Lodge's security system to protect a single disgraced prince. Each pound spent maintains not just buildings, but a system that confuses secrecy with security, tradition with stagnation. The failed transformation reveals a deeper truth. These shadow estates aren't anachronisms awaiting modernization, but active instruments of royal power. Their emptiness is their purpose, spaces held in reserve for royals who might need refuge from scandal, repositories for inconvenient truths, territorial markers of privilege that doesn't require justification. They remain unchanged because change would require admitting they shouldn't exist at all. Chapter 8. Hidden Histories Revealed. What the archives won't admit. In February 2023, construction workers renovating a drainage system at Royal Lodge made a discovery that stopped work for 6 weeks. A lead-lined box containing documents from 1936, the year of Edward VIII's abdication. Before palace officials arrived to confiscate the materials, workers photographed pages revealing that Fort Belvedere hosted meetings with German intelligence officers as late as November 1936, after war's inevitability was clear to anyone paying attention. This discovery was merely the latest in a pattern of suppressed revelations about the shadow estates, each uncovering histories that the monarchy has spent decades and millions ensuring would remain buried. The systematic concealment began with the royal archives themselves, housed at Windsor Castle but extending into climate-controlled vaults beneath each shadow estate. These aren't passive repositories, but active instruments of historical manipulation. Dr. Sarah Merchant, who spent 3 years researching royal properties before her access was revoked, describes an archive where documents disappear between visits, files are reclassified without explanation, and entire sections simply don't exist despite clear references in indices. Fort Belvedere's hidden history emerged partially through German archives, less susceptible to royal pressure. Documents in the German Foreign Office archive reveal that Rudolf Hess visited Fort Belvedere 3 times in 1935, meetings absent from all British records. The Mitford sisters, Nazi sympathizers who bridged British aristocracy and German fascism, used Fort Belvedere as what Unity Mitford called our safe house in letters discovered in her sister's estate in 2019. Diana Mitford's diary, thought destroyed, surfaced at auction in 2021, containing entries about the fort set's understanding with the new Germany that suggest coordination beyond mere sympathy. Archaeological surveys, mandated by insurance companies rather than historical interest, have revealed Fort Belvedere's basements extend far beyond the building's footprint, connecting to tunnel systems that predate the current structure by centuries. Ground-penetrating radar in 2018 identified what archaeologists carefully termed anomalies consistent with significant subsurface structures, chambers that appear on no architectural plans. When a team requested permission to excavate, they were told the ground was archaeologically sterile, despite their own evidence otherwise. Royal Lodge holds darker secrets still. The servants' graveyard, discovered during swimming pool construction in 2004, contained 203 bodies in unmarked graves dating from 1750 to 1920. No, records exist of these burials. People who spent their lives serving royalty erased even in death. Forensic analysis, briefly permitted before the site was declared sensitive, revealed evidence of tuberculosis, malnutrition, and, in several cases, trauma consistent with industrial accidents never reported. More troubling was the 2019 discovery during electrical work of a sealed room containing restraint equipment and medical instruments dating to the 1890s. Palace officials claimed it was a Victorian medical facility, but psychiatrist Dr. James Hartley identified equipment used for moral treatment of women deemed hysterical, essentially torture rebranded as therapy. Records show 3 young female servants dismissed for nervousness between 1891 and 1894. None appear in any records afterward. Bagshot Park's military connections run deeper than acknowledged. Freedom of Information requests to the Ministry of Defense were refused, but a retired intelligence officer revealed that Bagshot served as a black site during the Troubles, where IRA suspects were interrogated using enhanced techniques that violated British law. The soundproof rooms in the basement, officially wine cellars, match specifications for interrogation chambers. Local police records from the 1970s note military vehicles at Bagshot Park on dates that correlate with disappearances in Northern Ireland. The estate's role during World War II remains partially classified 80 years later. Station 14th's weapons development included biological warfare research conducted by Porton Down scientists in Bagshot's outbuildings. A laboratory accident in 1943 killed 4 researchers. Their deaths were attributed to influenza, and their families told they died in a bombing raid on London. The contaminated building was demolished in 1947. its rubble buried on the estate grounds in a location now beneath the tennis courts Prince Edward had built in 2001. Frogmore House guards its secrets most jealously. The royal mausoleum's underground chambers, never publicly acknowledged, contain more than royal bodies. During renovation in 1987, workers discovered documents sealed in lead cases dating to Queen Victoria's reign. One worker, speaking anonymously, described financial records showing payments to European banks that corresponded with dates when foreign royals died unexpectedly. "It looked like pension payments that stopped when certain people stopped breathing," he said. The estate's role in managing difficult royals extends beyond housing. Princess Victoria Melita, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was confined at Frogmore in 1901 for what was termed nervous exhaustion, but was actually punishment for divorcing within the royal family. Her diary, discovered in 2015 hidden beneath floorboards, describes forced sedation, restricted correspondence, and what she called therapeutic imprisonment. The palace claimed the diary was a forgery, but handwriting experts confirmed its authenticity before it disappeared into the royal archives. Digital archaeology has revealed more. Satellite imagery from the 1960s, recently declassified, shows structures at all four estates that no longer exist, or rather, that officially never existed. A building at Fort Belvedere, appearing in 1962 photos, vanished by 1965. Its footprint now covered by lawn that ground-penetrating radar reveals is only 18 inches deep above concrete. Bagshot Park had an entire wing demolished in 1971. No planning permission exists for either its construction or destruction. The human cost emerges in fragments. DNA testing of remains in the Royal Lodge Servants' Cemetery revealed that 12 bodies were of African descent, dating to the 1790s, enslaved people in Britain decades after slavery was supposedly abolished. Their existence appears in no royal household records. They were erased in life and remain unacknowledged in death, their stories recoverable only through science the palace cannot suppress. Former employees, emboldened by age and changing attitudes, have begun speaking despite non-disclosure agreements. Margaret Symington, housekeeper at Frogmore from 1962 to 1974, revealed before her death in 2022 that entire rooms were off-limits even to senior staff, protected by locks changed monthly. She once glimpsed inside during an emergency and saw filing cabinets marked with royal ciphers and dates spanning 3 centuries, an archive within an archive, hidden from history. Chapter 9. Legacy and Meaning. The Price of Preserved Privilege. The shadow estates of Windsor stand as monuments to a peculiarly British dysfunction, the ability to maintain medieval privilege through modern bureaucracy, to hide feudalism behind heritage preservation, to make taxpayers fund their own exclusion from properties they theoretically own. Fort Belvedere, Royal Lodge, Bagshot Park, and Frogmore House aren't merely royal residences, but active mechanisms for perpetuating inequality. Their very existence arguing that some spaces, some histories, some lives matter infinitely more than others. These properties cost British taxpayers approximately $20 million annually in direct expenses, but their true cost isn't measured in pounds. It's measured in the social housing not built while empty royal rooms receive million-pound renovations. It's calculated in the museums that charge admission, while royal collections worth billions remain private. It's counted in the historians' denied access to archives that would reveal inconvenient truths about how power actually operates. The architectural historian Sir David Cannadine, granted rare access to all 4 properties in 2019, described them as shrines to absence, meticulously maintained spaces that preserve not history, but hierarchy. Every polished doorknob in an unused room, Every manicured lawn no one walks, every heated corridor no one traverses, represents labor and resources extracted from the public to maintain the fiction that royalty requires such spaces to exist. Consider what these estates actually preserve. Fort Belvedere preserves the right to privacy so absolute that even Parliament cannot penetrate it. The intelligence services, bound by the Official Secrets Act, have less protection from oversight than a mock Gothic tower owned by the Crown. The property's current tenant, whose identity remains legally hidden, pays rent that disappears into Crown estate accounts so complex that forensic accountants describe them as designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Royal Lodge preserves the principle that royal failure carries no consequences. Prince Andrew, stripped of military honors and royal duties, accused of crimes that would destroy any commoner, retains a 30-room mansion because removing him would admit the system that placed him there was wrong. Every day he remains, protected by police and maintained by public funds, testifies that accountability stops at palace gates. Bagshot Park preserves the illusion of royal work. Prince Edward's various charitable endeavors, conducted from a 51-room mansion maintained at public expense, represent what anthropologist David Graeber called bullshit jobs, activity that appears productive while producing nothing of value. The estate enables Edward to seem busy while being idle, to appear public-spirited while remaining privately enriched. Frogmore House preserves death as spectacle. The mausoleums and memorials, the preserved rooms and gardens of grief, transform mourning into monument. While British councils struggle to maintain public cemeteries, millions flow toward maintaining the elaborate death cult of a single family. The Royal Mausoleum alone costs $500,000 annually to maintain, more than many communities spend on all their memorial spaces combined. But these estates preserve something deeper: the British public's complicity in their own subordination. Opinion polls consistently show majority support for the monarchy despite growing inequality, housing crises, and austerity. The shadow estates depend on this psychological architecture, the belief that some people deserve palaces while others deserve nothing, that heritage matters more than homelessness, that tradition justifies any expense. The environmental cost adds another layer of absurdity. Heating Fort Belvedere's empty rooms produces approximately 120 tons of CO2 annually. Royal Lodge's grounds require 2.5 million liters of water yearly in a region facing increasing drought. Bagshot Park's maintenance involves chemicals banned in commercial properties, but permitted through royal exemption. Frogmore's preserved Victoria interiors require climate control that consumes more energy than a small village. These estates are climate crimes masquerading as cultural preservation. The opportunity cost staggers when considered collectively. The $200 million spent on these 4 properties over the past decade could have built 800 social housing units, funded 50 community centers, or paid 5,000 nurses' salaries for a year. Instead, it maintained empty rooms, watered unused gardens, and protected properties from public access. Every penny represented a choice: privilege over provision, secrecy over service, the past over the future. International comparisons embarrass. France's former royal palaces generate $700 million annually in tourism revenue. Germany's converted palaces house universities, museums, and cultural centers. Even Russia's imperial estates, whatever their other failures, remain publicly accessible. Only Britain maintains royal properties as private playgrounds, their costs public, their benefits private, their existence justified by circular logic. They must be preserved because they're royal because they're preserved. The psychological impact on British society runs deeper than economics. These shadow estates teach that concealment is acceptable, that public money can serve private interests, that some histories matter more than others. They normalize surveillance, secrecy, and the slow violence of maintaining inequality. Every child who grows up knowing these palaces exist but can never enter learns their place in a hierarchy presented as natural rather than constructed. Legal scholar Philippe Sands argues these properties represent crystallized injustice, inequality made literal in stone and mortar. Their existence violates principles of democratic transparency, public benefit, and equal treatment under law. Yet they persist through what he calls the violence of bureaucracy. The thousands of small administrative decisions that collectively maintain systems everyone knows are wrong, but no one can change. The climate activist Greta Thunberg, visiting Windsor in 2019, asked a question that haunts. How can you tell children to sacrifice for the future while maintaining empty palaces from the past? The shadow estates embody this contradiction, demanding collective sacrifice while preserving individual privilege, preaching modernization while practicing medievalism, claiming public service while serving only themselves. Chapter 10. The Reckoning, a Call to Open the Gates. We stand at Windsor's gates in 2024, facing the same walls that have hidden Fort Belvedere, Royal Lodge, Bagshot Park, and Frogmore House from public view for generations. Behind these barriers, 20 million of public money annually maintains monuments to inequality, while Britain faces its worst housing crisis in living memory. The time for polite acceptance has passed. These shadow estates must be opened, repurposed, or surrendered. The evidence is undeniable. We've traced how Fort Belvedere hosted fascist sympathizers while hiding behind royal privilege. We've exposed Royal Lodge as a golden cage for a disgraced prince, protected at public expense. We've revealed Bagshot Park's military secrets and excess, Frogmore's transformation into an elaborate tomb. We've counted the servants who died building these estates, the workers whose labor was erased, the communities impoverished to maintain empty grandeur. The Windsor shadow estates aren't just embarrassing anachronisms, they're active wounds in British democracy. Every locked gate denies the principle of public ownership. Every classified document hides accountability behind tradition. Every million spent on empty rooms could house the homeless, feed the hungry, heal the sick. These properties don't preserve history, they perpetuate harm. The solution is simple, though its implementation requires courage. These estates must be opened to full public access, their archives released without redaction, their costs subjected to the same scrutiny as any public expenditure. Fort Belvedere's secrets must be excavated, literally and figuratively. Royal Lodge must be converted to public use, or Prince Andrew must pay market rent. Bagshot Park must justify its existence or be sold. Frogmore must become the museum it pretends to be, or close. This isn't republicanism, it's accountability. A modern monarchy compatible with democracy cannot maintain secret estates at public expense. The younger royals claim to understand this, speaking of transparency and reduced costs. But words without action are merely performance. If William truly represents change, let him open Fort Belvedere's archives. If Charles means to slim down the monarchy, let him start with these bloated properties. The British public must also reckon with its role. These estates persist because we allow them to persist, because we mistake secrecy for dignity, tradition for justification. Every visitor to Windsor who doesn't ask about the hidden properties, every taxpayer who doesn't question their expense, every citizen who accepts that some spaces remain forbidden, all participate in maintaining this system. The shadow estates of Windsor reveal the monarchy's true nature, not the fairy tale of public service, but the reality of private privilege maintained through public funds. They show us who we are, a nation that tolerates inequality so profound we've literally built walls around it. The choice is ours. We can continue funding these monuments to privilege, or we can demand they serve the public who pays for them. We can accept secrecy, or we can require transparency. We can preserve inequality in amber, or we can build a future where every citizen has access to their own history. The gates of Fort Belvedere, Royal Lodge, Bagshot Park, and Frogmore House must open, not eventually, now.